Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. My name is Dr. Drum McNaughton, and I'm the CEO of The Change Leader, a management consultancy that helps university leaders create sustainable higher ed institutions through holistic approaches to strategic management, university academics and operations, change management, leadership, and governance. Our podcast brings you the latest in higher ed news, as well as some of the top experts in our profession who will share with you their perspectives on how you can grow your institution. Our podcast welcomes back one of our favorite guests, Tom Netting, who's here to give us an update on what's going on in Washington and at the Department of Education, as well as Congress with the Higher Education Act. Tom has worked in public policy arena for over 28 years, advocating before Congress, federal agencies, and state governments on behalf of private institutions of higher education and post-secondary education companies. He's a leader in strategic policy development and advocacy in the areas of higher ed and workforce development, healthcare, veterans affairs, and procurement. Tom, welcome back to the show. Great to have you here.
Drum, it's good to be back with you. Thank you for inviting me back.
Oh, my pleasure. Let's get started. You and I have done this a few times before, and we know each other pretty well. What's the latest coming out of the zoo circus that we know as Washington, D.C.?
You got me smiling. What's not going on out of the zoo and the circus these days? I'll start on the regulatory side because there has been a considerable amount of activity. As you well know, and as we've spoken on previous podcasts, the Department of Education has been attempting to make a lot of revisions to the Obama administration and the Obama legacy in terms of some of their regulatory changes. Most recently, and I'll start with the most recent one because it's a pretty big change, probably an earthquake, pardon the pun, with the magnitude earthquakes that have gone out in California. But a seismic shift in terms of the legislation, or the regulation related to gainful employment. On the Friday before July 1st, the Friday right before the long holiday weekend, the department soft launched a final rule that individuals within the entire higher ed community and those onlookers to the community have been waiting for quite some time. It had been anticipated that this would be regulatory revisions that the administration and the Trump administration would put out before November 1st of last year in order to meet what they call the master calendar deadline. Any regulation to go into effect must be either published in final form on or before November 1st of the preceding year in order to go into effect July 1st of the subsequent year. Well, the department didn't meet that goal with regard to two key pieces of regulation: the borrower defense to repayment regulations and the gainful employment rule. But they noticed their intent to continue to move forward with those regulations. Well, lo and behold, literally just before July 1st of this year, the department did in fact publish the final rule that included a rescission of all of the 2014 regulations with respect to gainful employment. That included all of the subpart Q and the subpart R provisions in the regulations. The full rescission was effective because of the master calendar, July 1, 2020, not 2019. But as the secretary has the authority to do under the Higher Education Act, there's a provision in the law that states that if the secretary so deems, she or he can make the opportunity or afford the opportunity for the affected parties to implement the regulations sooner. Secretary DeVos made the decision that this regulation could be implemented early, meaning that institutions that so choose could actually implement it upon enactment and in promulgation and publication of the final rule. The final rule did get published in the Federal Register on July 1st, meaning that institutions that chose to could actually implement the regulation right now. Interestingly enough, the department included an electronic announcement number 122. That electronic announcement made clear that institutions could early implement and made very prescriptive recommendations on all of the provisions that an institution that early implemented the rule would no longer have to respond to or be required to fulfill. Those included everything from reporting requirements that the schools have become accustomed to responding to every October, student warnings for programs that had been deemed as failing programs, any further notification or follow-up on pending appeals with the department, as well as a host of other issues. So there was, as again I said, a seismic shift with the publication of this information on Friday the 28th, and then the official publication on February 1st. The provisions themselves, Drum, that were removed were literally everything having to do with the gainful employment rule and regulations. That includes all of the discussions that you and I both know have gone on, dating all the way back to the beginning of and the onset of the gainful employment discussions with the Obama administration in 2009. So this went through the 2009, 2010 regulations, the more recent 2014 regulations, and now with the 2019 regulations, rescinded everything that had come before it.
That's not necessarily, well, if you're a for-profit university, I think that's a great thing that could happen for them. But from a student protections perspective, I'm not so sure that that's a great thing. I don't know. Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, good leading question, because the department did do something that I think addresses some of that issue and addresses some of those concerns. They didn't, while rescinding all of this, they didn't leave it without the void filled, at least to some degree. Now, obviously, there are a number of individuals, legal aid society, other groups, the individuals that have been concerned about not only the abuses or the concerns with abuse within the for-profit community, but concerns with shorter-term programs and career and technical education programs across the entire spectrum. Keep in mind, gainful employment applied equally to a considerable number of community colleges and traditional institutions as well. Most notably, the Harvard program that was scrapped as well under the gainful employment rule because it failed to meet the criterion. But the important thing is, to your point, is for students and for, I think, the community as a whole, what the department has suggested and stated that they plan to do to move forward is make significant changes to the College Scorecard and add additions to that scorecard that would address disclosures that would take a lot of the information previously part of gainful employment and adopt it and transition it into the College Scorecard, where all students could see the same type of information regardless of type of institution or type of program. They specifically talk about some of the same underpinnings of the methodology or the thought process with regard to median income for the Federal Direct Loan Program, the Graduate Plus Program, and the Plus Loan Program being new additions to the College Scorecard so that individuals can see what like-minded peers have had in terms of their indebtedness, and also will be forecasting and providing in those college scorecards what the income levels of individuals will be. So as the regulations have continued to mature, and candidly, as the last round of negotiated rulemaking showed, when all programs at all institutions were being potentially subject to the rule, it caused a great deal of the discussion to turn to the fact that maybe this was better to be a disclosure, at least at first, and then if continuing to be an issue or in areas where it's shown to be an issue, then look at further enforcement. But the opportunity to have this as part of the College Scorecard, allow for all students to see on the scorecard all of this information in the form of disclosure, regardless of discipline, program, or type of institution, I think addresses some of those concerns. It doesn't get to programs that seem to be doing lesser than, which is obviously still a concern, but there are a number of people that believe that the department has many other regs and regulatory enforcement tools and mechanisms to address those concerns on a institution by institution basis.
I think you're right. And if in fact they can get the College Scorecard to where it should be and it applies to all institutions, that would be a really good thing. The other piece with this is the regulatory they're shifting a lot of the burden for compliance down to and student protections down to the individual state attorneys. You saw that as part of the NEGREG process.
That's correct.
And so if, in fact, the three legs of the stool can work together, which is always we all know what assume means. If that can work, then maybe this will be better. I think the jury's going to be out on this one for a little while.
Well, and again, like it's taken us time, and I understand people's frustrations and concerns that fought hard for this regulation and fought hard for what they believed were a number of needed and necessary protections. But we've learned a lot over that period of time, over the last 10 years. And in retrospect, I think if we look back on it, and if you look back on it with an unjaundiced view, a lot of what we've learned is that maybe this is better as a disclosure than as a guillotine or a punitive action. And maybe as we move forward, looking at it from the perspective, again, of all programs at all institutions, we'll learn even more on how to help institutions improve the process of assessment through the triad, with accreditation looking at curriculum, the states looking at their role and responsibility from a consumer-driven side, especially with the AGs, and then the department with the oversight and the delivery of financial aid, and maybe come to a better place at the end of all of this.
We can only hope. So the other big thing is another big thing that's going on is the Higher Education Act renewal, and I know we've spoken about that before. That seems to be on track, especially with Senator Alexander wanting to push this thing through before the end of his term.
Absolutely. I do want to touch base on one quick thing before we go away from the regulatory side. There is still a great deal more going on regulatorily. The borrower defense to repayment regulations that I alluded to, who have gone through their own various maturations of whether or not those regulations would be published in a final rule, whether or not the department, based on court decisions, would have to go back and totally rewrite those rules, or could move forward with the existing rule based on the most previous NEGREG. Those regulations have been determined by the department to be able to go forward, probably still subject to court challenges once they get published, but they are now sitting over with the Office of Management and Budget and are likely to be published as a final rule in the not too distant future. We also have 3 packages that the most recent round of federal negotiated rulemaking on accreditation and innovation were able to achieve something that is not often but is hard fought for, and that's consensus on all 3 of their packages of regulations. The department published back in June, the end of May, beginning of June, noticed that the first of those packages was subject to notice of proposed rulemaking and the ability for the community and all interested parties to make notice of any changes or recommendations. Those are subject to a deadline of this Friday, July 12th. We have the other 2 packages of those regulations yet to come out in a NPRM, which I think everybody will take the opportunity to respond to. The good news is, because the community came to consensus, I think they're well on their way to a final rule by this November 1st. And we have the notice of proposed rulemaking that has already gone out on Title IX and Clery changes that we're expecting a final rule on. That's a good segue, because Title IX and Clery is one of the things that is at the forefront of the discussions on the Senate Health Committee's dialogue with regard to reauthorization. So, leaving the regulatory side, we do anticipate and expect this administration to put forth some final rules on Title IX and Clery that are probably not going to be to the liking of the Democrats up on Capitol Hill. So much so that in the context of shifting over to the legislative side now, the Health Committee has been in dialogue at the staff level, meaning the highest level staff, and also all of the committee staffers for all of the collective individuals on the Senate Health Committee, Democrats and Republicans alike, discussing a final reauthorization bill and a comprehensive bill. As I understand it, as late as today, there are still 3 major areas where at the full committee, upper level staff level, as well as within the rank and file on both sides, there are disagreements and areas where they simply haven't been able to come to terms or any type of a compromise. Those include institutional eligibility, and accountability, which are a broad category that I'll talk about here in a minute, but also Title IX being one of those that Ms. Murray in particular, but a number of the Democrats, and candidly a number of Democrats down the aisle that are running for president as candidates, are all looking to protect the interest of the victims and are a little bit concerned that the most recent proposals coming from a number of the Republicans and the administration are giving too much latitude and potentially too much protections for the accused as opposed to the victims. There is obviously a balancing act that needs to go on there. There are clear areas where the concerns of both the victim and as well as the accused come into play, and they're having a hard time parsing out exactly where those lines are that protect victims from things like being in close proximity to their accuser at an institution being one of the high-level issues that everybody continues to grapple with. And candidly, we grappled with in all of the negotiated rulemakings that preceded this. There are a number of other issues as well. I won't go into all of them. But in addition to the Title IX and Clery concerns and institutional accountability and eligibility, there are also some concerns around issues with the loan repayment and with the opportunity for public service loan forgiveness and other types of loan forgiveness programs, as well as the reduction in the number of overall repayment programs. So those three key issues, institutional accountability and eligibility, the Title IX Clery, and the balance on protecting the victims as well we should, but also looking at trying to provide some protection for the accused in the process as well. And then also the loan repayment rates and loan forgiveness programs are areas where they haven't been able to come to any type of amicable solution or any type of compromise. So where that leaves us on July 9th, with a shortened period before the end of the year, because let's be honest, if we get into next year, the farther we get into 2020 and an election year, the less likely there is for reauthorization to take place, is that you have Senator Alexander and Senator Murray and staff continuing to hold their meetings every week, and then also continuing every Friday, as I understand it, with the Republicans, and I think with the Democrats having meetings within the party lines to discuss what conversations have taken place, trying to come up with a comprehensive bill. If they don't come to a comprehensive bill, there are all sorts of discussions on what a plan B or C might be, especially for Senator Alexander. As you mentioned, this is his swan song in a lot of respects, and you hear the term legacy thrown out more often recently than not on the desire for Senator Alexander to put his stamp or at least have the opportunity to make some revisions to the Higher Education Act, which he holds so dear, given his former positions with the University of Tennessee and certainly as the Secretary of Education. He's had the opportunity to work through reauthorizations of elementary and secondary, career and technical education, WIA and the workforce issues, but not on higher ed, and he'd certainly like to do so before his departure. So the question becomes, does he have the opportunity to do that? And is it a full-blown reauthorization? Is it going forward with a Republican bill because of the inability to come to a bipartisan agreement with Senator Murray that he's done so often before on so many other pieces of legislation like elementary and secondary? Or does he look to come up with smaller bills or smaller chunks of information that are bipartisan in nature, in keeping with his longstanding policy of working in a bipartisan fashion, and try and move smaller chunks now as opposed to having nothing at the end of the 116th Congress? That puts a lot of pressure on where they go in the next couple of months, certainly this month leading into the August recess. But it also means that we have to look at the House. And over in the House of Representatives, you've got Chairman Scott, who has completed his 5 bipartisan hearings that he and Ranking Member Fox agreed to. They completed those at the end of June, beginning of this month. They do have another hearing scheduled for next week on apprenticeships and a continued discussion around apprenticeships programs, which continue to be a considerable part of discussions of both labor issues and workforce issues, as well as higher ed issues. And then it becomes a question of whether or not Mr. Scott and the House Democrats are inclined to want to move reauthorization on their side. Candidly, what I've heard thus far is that Mr. Scott, if he were to move legislation, would want to move a comprehensive bill, not piecemeal, and doesn't believe that doing it piecemeal or doing it in small parts or taking only pieces of it and moving them forward is the way to go. So you've got a lot of movement, a lot of different things going on, but no real assurance or guarantee on exactly how it's all going to play out.
Well, it certainly is a lot of things that are going on. Honest opinion, and I know you always give me one anyway, so my saying that really is a Department of Redundancy department. Do you think there is the political will to compromise on something like this?
I'm taking a deep breath for a reason. I think that there are pieces of reauthorization that everybody can come to terms with and come to agreement on. And they are much needed and are ones that, in the interest of students, first and foremost, and we all have our own way of always wanting to say we're putting students first, and sometimes that's a panacea and sometimes it's not. But in this particular instance, issues with regards to student loan interest rates, with regard to a number of these repayment programs, and trying to deal with financial literacy and doing things to better inform the students and also better educate them of their responsibilities as well. Because these are loans, after all, are important, as are things like simplification of the FAFSA, which certainly has been something that we've seen that there is bipartisan support for. If you had to put me to the final statement, unfortunately, I don't think reauthorization gets done this year. I would be surprised if the Democrats have time, especially starting this late in the first term of the 116th Congress, to basically put together a comprehensive bill unless they were to simply take the AIM Higher Act that they put out at the tail end of the 115th Congress. There are major issues with that legislation, not even looking at it philosophically or from the terms of what is included, but simply from a sheer scoring standpoint. That piece of legislation, I don't remember the exact figures and I won't even try and quote them, but I know that it was a rather exorbitant number that came along with that bill. And we still have to look at things from a fiscal standpoint, Drum. So the Democrats' wish list would have to be winnowed away at in order to come up with something that could be more fiscally palatable. That would have to be mirrored up against a bill that I would think would be considerably different, because the Senate bill is going to be bipartisan, or the pieces that come forward are likely to be bipartisan. If they're partisan in nature, you get nowhere because you've got a Republican bill up against a Democratic bill, which is likely not to go anywhere. So trying to find that middle ground and trying to do it leading into an election year is going to be tough. Now, having said all that and having said my opinion, history is on your side and on the side of the potential for reauthorization to get done. Being somewhat of a student of history, the last time we got a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act was heading into an election year. So, we at least have that as past as prologue to see whether or not the sides can come together, and a lot of action and a lot of activity can take place, while certainly there will be much other activity going on around it.
Well, you know me, I tend to be an optimist, so I'll keep that optimistic look, and maybe some of that'll rub off on Washington. Who knows?
and I'm smiling with you because, again, without getting myself into too much trouble, Congress needs to act. This is, we're running now on it. It was one thing when the reauthorization is supposed to take place every 5 to 6 years, and we were running on a 10-year track. We've now exceeded that 10-year track. We had 98 reauthorization, 2008. We're now on 2019. Students and the system candidly deserves better than that. And this is where I'm getting up on a little bit of a soapbox. And I recognize that there are a lot of reasons for this, but going these lengths of time between the reauthorizations doesn't serve anybody well. It doesn't serve that triad well that we talked about earlier in this conversation. It certainly doesn't serve the students well because so much has changed since the 2008 genre. Look at all of the pieces of college costs, student debt, as well as academics that have changed. Look at the ability that we haven't addressed yet, or they haven't had a chance to address yet, with things like all of the changes in direct assessment, competency-based education, and things that the world is moving on and higher ed policy is moving on at the institutional level and in the realistic world, but Congress is not keeping up with it. And that's a problem.
It certainly is. So we're coming up to the end of our time, as we always do. It just the half hour always seems to go by much quicker than it does. What are the three things you'd advise university presidents to keep an eye on that are going to affect their institution coming up in the next 6 months?
In the next 6 months, I would say obviously the regulatory front. If nothing else, not the college presidents, certainly their financial aid offices, and also their human resources and their campus law enforcement offices. As the changes come about regulatorily in Title IX and Clery, that transcends not only the front office of the administration, but certainly all the way over to my friends and brethren, having formerly represented IACLEA, the International Association of Campus Law Enforcement Administrators, and the responsibility of both our certified and non-certified law enforcement individuals and their responsibilities. So all of the regulatory issues that are coming forward, meeting the opportunity to provide comment on those notices of proposed rulemaking would be number two, and looking at that from a holistic institutional perspective. And then number three would be keeping a watchful eye on whether or not either shortly before or shortly after the August recess, and keep in mind, normally Congress is out of session for the entire month of August. So either between now and the end of this month or between now and the end of September, whether or not there is a Senate bill that moves forward in some fashion or another. If you don't see Senate legislation moving forward by September, I'd say that the chance of legislation getting done gets smaller and smaller, obviously, as we get further and further through the first session of the 116th Congress and into the election year and all of the second session beginning in 2020.
I'm going to add one more to that. And I think presidents ought to be taking a look at that college scorecard, because the changes that are going to come down with that are going to affect everybody that's out there. And if you're not making comments when it comes up for comment, I think you're going to be hurting yourself and your institutions.
Fair enough. One thing I would, and again, building off of your statement, and I'll share it with you, Drum. Again, everybody can get it in the Federal Register or from the department itself, is taking a look at that plan of how they look to change the college scorecard. The department did do something in one of their appendices that was very helpful. They showed the 2014 gainful employment regulations, then what is in the current college scorecard, and what would be changed going into it with their plan. I will send that to you. I think it is a pretty good, quick assessment of showing how some of this transition that we alluded to, and at least some of the opportunity for disclosures, are part of what they look like through the college scorecard. I'd be happy to send that along to you, and maybe, I don't know if you can have it as an attachment to the download of the podcast, or some way that we can present it, or at least have it available if people inquire and we can send it to them. But I think you're right. I think looking at the college scorecard in its entirety, and don't forget, the College Navigator site has been something that the department has spent a great deal of time on. So the college scorecard, net price calculator, and things of that nature for institutional disclosure are something that schools should keep an eye on. I think you're right.
Well, great. Well, Tom, it's always a pleasure. What's next for you? You got anything on the horizon?
We do. There's a couple of things that obviously, while we all continue to deal with the day-to-day, we are very much looking forward to CSPAN's 5th annual conference that is coming up in Chicago, Illinois on August 21st through the 23rd. We have a number of Department of Ed officials. We have a number of invited guests talking on the regulatory front and the accreditation front. You talked about the triad. We have a number of the national accreditors coming together for a panel. We have a panel of a number of the individuals that were involved in the most recent negotiated rulemaking, some of those being overlapped with individuals that have been in the prior negotiated rulemaking, over 20 breakout sessions on a myriad of different issues. And I can't give you the surprises yet because they're still in the works. But on that Friday, the last day, is our legislative and regulatory dignitaries session. And I would love, Drum, at some point, once hopefully the invitees are confirmed, to share that with you and your guests so that maybe they can come and hear from a senator or two, or maybe some individuals in high places in workforce development.
Well, that'd be great, Tom. I'm happy to put something up on the website and in the podcast area on that whenever it's out.
Well, I want to thank you as always. It is a pleasure to share with you and with all of the individuals that listen in on these broadcasts. I find them to be quite helpful for me, especially given the level of other individuals that you bring to the table. And certainly, I want to make a formal hello to Diane, who I hope you will announce soon the opportunity that you're going to have with her. And again, shows just how phenomenal you are in terms of getting some of the top front individuals to come and participate. And I don't consider myself in that class, but I'm happy to be a part of what I am.
Well, you should consider yourself in a class. It's always a pleasure having you on the show, and thank you for the kind words. Until next time, my friend.
Enjoyed it. Thank you. Have a great day.
And you too. Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Tom Netting of Ackerman LLP, and for his Washington update on the Department of Ed and the Higher Education Act. Thanks, Tom. Always a pleasure having you on the show. Our next guest is a bit out of the ordinary for our podcast, but I promise you it'll be very interesting in that the guest, Grant Aldrich, CEO of OnlineDegree.com, has cracked the nut when it comes to helping higher ed institutions grow enrollment in the area of post-traditional students. His secret? You'll have to listen to the podcast to find that out. If you like this podcast, please take a minute to subscribe to the show. And if you're listening on the Apple Podcast app, would you please take a moment to give us a rating and review? Also, be aware that Apple is moving away from the iTunes name for podcasts, so stay tuned to find out the new name. You can find out more information and show notes at changinghighered.com. And if you have guests and/or other topics you'd like to hear about, please email us at podcast@changinghighered.com to let us know. Remember, creating sustainable higher ed institutions requires three things: taking a holistic view of your institution, aligning strategies, structures, and processes, and ensuring stakeholders are attuned to where you're going. Without any of those three things, you won't get your institution where you want it to go. Until next time.